Everything from pre-season focus to your in-season focus from an athlete's perspective, and of course for strength and conditioning coaches looking to sharpen their processes and systems when it comes to programming for AFL athletes. It's round one, so I think it's pretty fitting to get into this topic. And for anyone that's tuning in live, whether it be over Instagram or on YouTube, feel free to use the comment section and send in your questions, and I'll answer them. But make sure to hang around for the whole show, because I'm going to be discussing some research-based solutions on why you want to be focusing on these 4 key areas. And they're also 4 key mistakes that I think you can easily slip into as a strength and conditioning coach or footballers from a mindset point of view when it gets into in-season. So let's get straight into it, and then at the end I'll update our guests for the upcoming week on the podcast. But straight away, for our pre-season focus is developing robust athletes to be able to handle game load, back-to-back match load. It's a long competitive season, so we want to be able to build robust athletes, and we do that through exposure of chronic load, both in volume, so the distance that athletes cover over a week, as well as your high speed running and very high speed running, or known as sprint distance. And then, of course, the agility and the contact aspect of the game as well. So we want to develop robust athletes. The reason that is important from a strength and conditioning perspective is that we pretty strongly believe that player availability has a strong correlation with team success. And it's probably no surprise for those that know football. If you have your best players on the park more regularly than not, you're more than likely to get into the top 4 or have a chance at getting into the top 4. And if you're in the top 4, you're more favorable to be able to play in the pointy end of September, which is what our focus is. So developing those robust athletes. But what can easily happen, and mistake 1, is that with the long competitive season, athletes can slip into thinking all the work is done in preseason, and as soon as the season comes around, it's now time to just focus on recovery. What that means is the intensity in the gym wears off, the intensity with main training session wears off, and all you're leaving your workload, your training load over the week, is all left to game day. This is problematic because your loads will be significantly reduced up to 50% if all you're relying on is on game day, and you're not getting in high intensity training both in the gym and on the field. In fact, one area that you can get a real competitive edge, and something that we do with our programming on the Prepare Like a Pro online program, is we have a stronger emphasis on strength and power in season compared to preseason. Preseason, there's a stronger emphasis with our conditioning and our football loads, so trying to maximize those. But as soon as we're in season, the load stripped off around 30% less volumes in what I talked about before, the total distance, the high speed running and the very high speed running typically. So we want to make sure that you're still developing and sharpening your weapon, because if you're not working hard in the gym as well as on main training sessions, i.e. lifting heavy, lifting fast and sprinting and doing hard accelerations, then you're going to be not in your best shape come September, but also you're not going to allow your team to be in your best shape to be able to get into that top 4 position. So intensity is so important. If we're going to bring the volume down, the intensity needs to go up. So that's a common mistake. The long competitive season can mean that we slip into this mode of only focusing on recovery during the week. We still need to get our areas of focus in, and you should still have training blocks where you periodize, you're focusing on your max strength, and then at periods you're focusing on your power, a bit of both at times. And then on the field, you're working on your sprints and you're working on making sure you're training in above match intensity. And I'll talk some of the metrics that you can use to measure whether you're training at match intensity, whether you're using GPS or, for those local players, just rate of perceived exertion. But mistake number 1 is that long competitive season. Now, what we don't want to disregard the fact it's a long competitive season. So if you're a strength and conditioning coach working in football, you need to be able to read the cues with your athletes and make sure that it's a fun and engaging environment. If they feel like they're doing the same warm-up routine, the same active recovery routine, the gym hasn't changed at all, and it's getting stale, you want to make sure that you're adding in an element of variation where you're still getting in your big rocks of your training, i.e. you're lifting heavy still, you're working on your power, you're still doing your resilience work on eccentric hamstring strength and groin strength and hip stability, core control work, but you might be changing the routine in the way things are done. At times it might be done in total body sessions, might be done in lower body split sessions to upper body. It might be done, some of it's done before. So your power-based stuff is actually done before the field to prime them for the field training, and then the gym after training for those training in semi-professional environments there's less duration. So they feel like they're getting home earlier, can have a positive effect. Sometimes it might be just stripping the gym session altogether and just getting the whole group to follow the same program that's only going to take 15 minutes rather than following their individual program. So have some things where you reduce the load, but make sure that you majority of the time, 80% of the time, if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that you're still maximizing on your key focus areas. So you might be using percentage-based lifting to ensure that you're getting in progressive overload from a weights point of view. For your power, try and get competitions who can jump on the highest box if you haven't got gym aware, or who can throw the med ball the furthest, or you might do a speed bound index, which I've talked about before, the John Pryor SBI, and get competition involved in the gym. So intensity is key. And that's going to mean that you're going to continue to move the needle with your strength and power. And as I mentioned before, being a contest game, strength and power is so important come September. The game only gets more contested, higher pressure. So if the intensity is off and you're not still progressing your strength and power in season, you will notice a negative effect, and potentially you're not giving your club the best chance to perform, or you're not looking after a controllable anyway. So have that balance act, understand when it's starting to get stale, give back to the athletes, condense the program, make sure there's no fluff in there. So you don't just add in a superset for the sake of it. Have some key focus areas on how they can win that session, whether it be max reps at a particular percentage, maybe 80% on that lift, or it might be competition on who can throw the medicine ball the furthest to maximize power output. Whatever it is, have some constraints in place to ensure high intensity in your strength training sessions. And that might just mean the scheduling as well. So getting in your power as a whole group before, as part of the warm-up. So they do their group mobility warm-up, and then they go into their power development before. So they're doing it fresh. So things like that add some variation to your scheduling too. So hopefully that makes sense. Keep progressing, and absolutely should you be getting personal bests, especially if you're still relatively only been lifting for 5 years. Most of our athletes on our program, especially the developing ones, which is the majority on our Prepare Like a Pro program, hit PBs on their squat, bench press, and deadlift in season. All right, so it can be done if that's your mindset. Number 2, as I mentioned, the recovery culture. So if you're going from, let's say, over pre-season, your 4-week rolling average at times was up to 36 Ks over a week. And you strip that back down to only 24 or under, so more than 30% of reduced chronic volume, then you're doing your athletes a disservice. You're going to detrain all that work that you did over, particularly the January and February, the biggest months. You're going to start to see a detraining effect around that June, July period. So we need to make sure we're staying within our chronic loads of about 30%. So if that's for an AFL athlete, for your semi-professionals, you might be getting 30 Ks over a week over your chronic load of pre-season. So we want to maintain over 21 Ks per week. That's including game day in season. That's for your distance side of things. And that's just work out how much total distance you're doing over your typical week, particularly in the most recent month, so the last 4 weeks. If you're just finishing pre-season now, like the AFL men's athletes, if you've still got a few more weeks of pre-season, then backdate that from your round 1. Have a look at your total distance that you cover over the last 4 weeks. That's your 4-week rolling average. And then you want to make sure you're maintaining at least within 30% of that going forward. That means bye weeks isn't a time to just completely rest. You still want to maintain probably 2 running sessions. One where you're getting that, 7 to 8K, and then another one where you're getting match loads. And that will not only prevent your risk of injury, but it will also allow you to continue to recover well from the game and be able to back up game after game. So from a performance point of view, it's also going to be really good for things like your energy and your ability to train at high intensity. So some research around that in terms of maintaining chronic load, particularly around fascicle length. So we want to maximize our fascicle length to reduce hamstring strains. And one of the key metrics with Tim McGrath's paper, which I'll add in the show notes, was a reduction in your 80%, so exposure to your 80% sprint speed. So for most male athletes, you might have a max velocity of 31, and our sprint distance that we will use will be distance above 25.5 k's per hour. That'll be roughly around your 80%. We want to make sure we're maintaining regular exposure to that to continue to have long fascicle lengths to reduce their hamstring strains, as well as maintaining, as I mentioned before, the importance of strength. So maintaining eccentric strength exposure, for example, like things like the Nordic. So they're a couple of really controllable things that you can do, both strength as well as regular exposures to very high speed running over your week to make sure that you're reducing your risk of injury. The other one was regular exposures, and this can be a big mistake, is not getting regular exposures at above 95% max velocity. So I like to have a target in place with the athletes I'm working with every fortnight. You want to be able to get exposure to above 95% of your max velocity. So if you've played on the weekend and all you hit was 88% of your max velocity, and then during that same week of training, you also hit under 95%. Let's say on Thursday's your main training session, you hit 90% that week. Then the next session on Thursday, we're going to open up a little bit more and ensure that you hit 95%. Okay, so it's never a moment where 2 games in a row or 2 weeks in a row where you're not getting that exposure, and that just maintains your ability to be resilient to max sprinting efforts. So then when you next are getting exposed, maybe you're the last defender and you've got to chase down the forward, and the ball's dribbling out in front towards the goals, and you're chasing that defender down for a hard tackle. Your hamstrings are exposed, your hip flexors are exposed, your whole body is exposed to that intensity. So that's really, really important. So sprinting in your main training session is critical, and having some sort of measure, whether you're using a time-based flying 40 or GPS to work out whether you're getting that regular exposure of max velocity. So that would be mistake number 2, maintain your chronic loads, both in volume, high-speed running and very high-speed running, and sprint distance. In terms of mistake number 3, that max velocity exposure, and that we want to have that within either -2 from game day or -3. That research is from Martin Boucher, which again I'll add to the link. Mistake number 3 also mistake number 4 will be your ability to train at above match intensity. If we look at Jason Delaney's work with rugby athletes, the metrics he used is work rate per minute, which everyone commonly knows, the distance that you're achieving per minute. Typically, like a midfielder might get 120 meters per minute. So we want to make sure that during your main training session, you're training above that for your training drills. So if you're averaging 120 work rate per minute, we want to work up to 140, 150 meters per minute. The average accelerations that you're completing in a minute, particularly important for your inside mids, your speed forwards, your speed defenders, your key forwards, so those that really need to get off the mark really quickly. And we can use that to determine if you're training at that intensity, particularly from a combative point of view as well, when we're looking at deceleration. So use the accelerations per minute as a guide of match intensity, and are you training at your match? So if you work out your norm from playing a few games or looking at last year's data, make sure your main training sessions you're getting above that in at least 1 or 2 of the drills. Then the last one, metabolic power range, he looked at anywhere between 1 and 10 minutes. So looking at the worst case scenario when you're expending the most amount of energy and ensuring that you're matching that or going above that in your football, your main training session in a week. So there are 3 different ones that you can look at that research has showed and proven to ensure that you're preparing yourself for the upcoming game, as well as reducing your likelihood of injury. And I'll add in the link to that research as well in our show notes. You just head over to preparelikeapro.com/podcast to find our show notes. So hopefully that's a bit of a snapshot on your key focuses. To break it down, we want to make sure that we're continuing to still develop robust athletes. So by lifting heavy, lifting fast in the gym, that's critical. Continue to do your injury mitigation work, the resilience work with intent and quality. So your Copenhagen's, your Nordics, anything that you've had maybe some injuries with the past. So if you're maintaining Achilles tendinopathy, patella tendinopathy, if you've had shoulder surgery, whatever it might be, continue to do the work for you to keep your body healthy. That is really, really important. Number two, maintain your training intensity and don't let your volume drop off. So the volume is probably more important talking to the strength and conditioning coaches that manage that. So for the athletes speaking, make sure your intent and your intensity is there on main training session, and you're not just going through the motions and just thinking that playing games every week is going to get you through. Number three, exposure to max velocity. So making sure every couple of weeks you're hitting above 95% of your max velocity to keep your hamstrings safe, which was, as we know, is the highest risk of injury from a soft tissue point of view, and a controllable one. So making sure you're doing that, as well as maintaining that chronic exposure of very high speed running across your week. More importantly, on your main training session, you're getting in 80% of your weekly loads on that main training session, and maintaining your Nordic strength as well, that eccentric ham strength. And then number four was our training at above intensity, both from a meters per minute, accelerations per minute, and your total amount of metabolic power. So if you have any questions on that topic, make sure to hit me up. In terms of the podcast this week, we have on Wednesday, Lewis Marzo is going to be discussing effective methods to use to develop and maximize athletic development. We have our interview with David Joyce on Wednesday that's going to be published, and Friday, our Jared Majda bite-sized episode. So if you enjoyed that bite-size, you can check out and listen to the whole episode. Podcast I listened to recently, for anyone that's managing their own business or interested in marketing, check out the Digital Marketing Podcast. They recently just published a podcast I listened to this morning about digital trends and update for 2023, and they talked about ChatGPT at length and some of the pros and cons, more on the cons, about all the hype that it's getting and how actually it's not that effective, and that ultimately people want to connect with humans and be able to read organic and authentic content, and that actually ChatGPT is highly dependable on how effective and the quality it produces on the input that it receives. So you need to be quite mindful of what you put into the ChatGPT, depending on what you want to get out of it. So listen to that. I found that a lot of benefit out of that, managing my own business and from a marketing point of view. Power tip for this week: 3 factors that influence a strength program when I'm thinking about my programming. So we want to think about time. How much time do you have with the athletes? Number 2, think about your space and your equipment. So how's it all going to flow is critical, especially with large groups. So you don't want to superset things that are on a completely other end of the gym. You want to make sure things are in sections and it flows well with the space you're working in. And then number 3, the state of the athletes. And sometimes that you won't know that until you're actually there in front of them, training with them. But more often than not, if you're working in the elite setting, you would have seen the session they just completed on the field, particularly relevant when we're in preseason. And if they've just done a huge session, you're going to need to take that into account at times. At other times, you just need to get the work done. When we're in season, it's more important just for them to keep them in check from a mental point of view, because they're just going to be focusing on the game, upcoming games. We want to make sure that we're focusing on the being in present and maximizing the work that's in front of us. As I talked about earlier, how important it is to continually move the needle with your strength and power in season. So that intent is really, really key and important to talk to. But of course, if the athletes aren't be able to produce the power, you need to take into account where you're fitting things in during the week. So we know through the research we can produce max force pretty well under fatigue. So doing your max force work early in the week would make sense, like maybe 2 days after the game or 3 days after the game. And then your main power stimulus should be a couple of days before the game or 3 days before the game, because your central nervous system would be recovered by that point midweek. So focusing on power middle of the week, they'll also prime you for your main training session and also your game leading up to that game. So that works quite well. As we know as well with max strength training and doing some more of those outer range movements like Bulgarian split squats, by doing them early in the week, their body's still in that recovery mode anyway. So it's not too close to the game, where if you're training 48 hours before the game and you're doing those type of lifts and they're sore going into the game, you might lose the athletes. So do the more outer range eccentric based movements early in the week where the athletes are already sore, and then focus more on your punchy, high speed, high power CNS stuff that's going to fire them up middle of the week leading into the game. That's it. If you want to join our program, we've got a 2-week free trial with no obligation. So you can just click the link in our Instagram bio. If you're listening in live, we've still got our round one massive discount where you can save over $500 on our yearly online strength edition program. We've got 3 of them, a development one. So for parents listening in, that's for those new to strength and conditioning and also those that are under the age of 18. Number 2, we've got a gainers for those that want to gain strength and power and put extra work in the gym. And then number 3, our all-round athletic program. So for those that don't want to change their body composition, but they just want to maximize their athlete development for football. So if you're interested, head over to preparelikeapro.com. As I said, you can save over $500. That's an exclusive offer. I only offer it once a year during round one. So check it out and make sure to purchase that. It will expire before the Richmond and Carlton game. Good luck with all your tips and hopefully you enjoy round one. Really looking forward to it, and good luck to everyone that's playing practice matches this weekend. I'll see you next week.